people can be really good at what they do and they can win. But if you want to be remembered for what you do, you have to change the way that it's done. You can be really, really good at doing things that people have done before, and you can win that way. But if you want to have a lasting legacy in whatever it is that you do in life, regardless of sport or if it's martial arts or whatever, if you want to have a lasting impact, you've got to be a...
Hey everyone, I'm Amit Savakoli. Today we welcome Jackson Rudolph to the podcast. Some of you may know him as the guy with the green bostaff in his hands, but today we get to learn about his early days as a white belt to him joining Team Paul Mitchell. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe and comment below your favorite part. May I please welcome Jackson Rudolph. Awesome. Thank you so much, Jackson, for hopping on, man.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. So we're going to sort of walk into the first day you started martial arts. Like, tell me about your first class.
Yeah, I mean, it goes way back, but I started martial arts when I was 6 years old. And it's kind of funny the way that I got involved in the first place was my first grade teacher in elementary school was a black belt. And we had this silent auction at one of our school carnival events for a 2-week introductory course for the local martial arts school where she was a black belt at. And so naturally, I begged and practically forced my parents to sign up for the silent auction. And they wound up winning the 2-week introductory course. And I was just like your regular kid there for my 2-week course. And that's how it started. Being so young, I don't remember the content of that very first class, but I know that as a white and yellow belt, I was absolutely hooked. I loved it. Was not very naturally gifted. My parents considered pulling me out of class a couple of times, but I loved it. And that's the reason that I kept coming back.
Yeah, for me, I was really into ninjas. And that was the thing that I just got hooked on. And I watched like a bunch of ninja shows and I told my parents, like, this is what I got to do. I started when I was 6 years old. And I'm 19 now. So I've been in the game for quite a bit of time, just like you. What was the thing that really caught you with the bostaff specifically? Like how did you go from white belt to the bostaff is going to be my thing?
My big one was probably Jackie Chan. I remember like growing up watching Jackie Chan, or not Jackie Chan, Samurai Jack. That's what I meant. And I thought that was like the most awesome cartoon ever. And so if you would ask like 6-year-old Jackson what weapon he wanted to be good at, the answer was probably going to be sword. But I got really fortunate that a bow got put in my hands. Ultimately, I was going through a relatively traditional Taekwondo program. It was a little hybrid, a little Americanized. We did plenty of self-defense. There was some Hapkido in there, but it was generally a traditional Taekwondo program. And in the mid-2000s, my instructor decided to purchase the XMA program, Extreme Martial Arts, by Mike Chat, which was like the upgrade program for a martial arts school at the time. And, it came in this box full of DVDs that you had to, put in and watch. And our school started doing that program. And because I was somebody that practically signed up for every class that I could in the school, of course I was going to do the XMA program. And it was through that program that my instructor first put a bow in my hands. And I was hooked on it from that point on. So it's not like, I saw Donatello and then decided I wanted to be a bow master. It was really a very fortunate set of circumstances where my instructor started up a new program, and next thing you knew, that's what I was learning and fell in love with it.
How did you go from just getting hooked on the bostaff to becoming like a century martial artist and hyper martial arts and Team Paul Mitchell? Like, how did it go from you just got introduced to the bostaff to this is like my thing now? Like, this is what I'm going to do full force. Like, kind of walk me through the story.
Well, I've been incredibly blessed in my journey to be given a lot of amazing opportunities along the way that allow some of those things on my resume to be true, like the hyper stuff and, being an endorsed athlete by Century. And we'll talk about that deal in a little bit more detail. But when you ask about making the transition from like being that kid who was just given a bow and falling in love with it to actually being somebody that bow is part of my identity, right? Like if you see me on the internet, most people that come across Jackson Rudolph know me for bow. In fact, I think more people worldwide probably know me as the guy with a green stick more so than by my name, right? And I think that honestly, it came from when I first started competing in sport karate. I knew that I wanted to be good at the extreme stuff, right? I thought the black uniform was cool. I thought being able to do your form to music was cool. And it was the people that I was watching early on, your Mac Immigs and Steve Taradas and Kalman Chokas. And it was watching those guys all doing extreme that inspired me. But early on in my sport karate career, I didn't think that I was ever going to be good at that. When I was making stage, I started winning divisions and making stage for the first time, like 2007 through 2009 is kind of my big come up. But most of those wins and stage appearances at NASKA, North American Sport Karate Association night shows, most of those events were for traditional forms and weapons. And if you had asked somebody at the time, hey, is this Jackson Rudolph kid going to be any good? They said, yeah, he might win some traditional overalls one day, right? Traditional overall grand championships, that is. And that's what my career trajectory was really looking like. And a lot of it was because I was never a tricker. Tricking, referring to kind of the hybrid martial art form that added in all the gymnastics and acrobatics. If you're a non-martial artist watching this, once you finish the episode, it's definitely worth a Google to check out what tricking is, because the whole like subculture of tricking is really interesting to study. But anyway, I was not that. I wanted to be that. I wanted to do all the cool flips and tricks, but I was never vertically gifted with my jumping ability. And so it was never something that was really accessible to me. And whereas with weapons, like I talked about the XMA program, you can learn weapons. You can repeat those techniques relatively easily through a video. But when you're trying to jump up in the air and do acrobatic kicks, in my opinion, that's a lot harder to recreate watching a video and then trying to do it yourself on the mat. And so just the way that I was trained and the way I came up, it was a perfect storm for me to never be a very good tricker. And so at one point in my career, I kind of accepted like, okay, you know, if I'm going to be good at this, I'm going to be a traditionalist. And I guess the extreme just wasn't for me. And then around 2010, I always loved bow. Even when I was winning with traditional weapons, it was always traditional bow. And I was competing in creative weapons at the same time. This is back before we had the 3-division split of creative, extreme, and musical. I'm dating myself a bit here. But back then, it was just creative and extreme, and you could use music at either division. So I was competing in creative. I would attempt to compete in extreme by doing a cartwheel, because the difference in the divisions is you have to invert in order for your form to be accepted in that division. And so I literally did a cartwheel to pick up my bow and then did a bow form from that point forward. Got me a couple wins here and there, but nothing too consistent. But anyway, so I discovered around 2010, my dad and I were training, and we said, well, what if we took the way that trickers link together their tricking combinations, the way that people can go spinning hook kick into a touchdown raise, into a gainer switch, into a cork, and they trick all the way across the mat. What if we took that concept and we applied that to bow? Because up until this point, people had done maybe 2 or 3 bow tricks at a time, but it was mostly stationary. And so the idea that my dad and I had is we said, well, what if we take bow tricks and we move it from one side of the ring to the other, and we put together combinations of 5, 6, 7 different releases into a combination. And there were a lot of people, some of my coaches included, that did not think it was going to work. It was kind of a controversial strategy because the more tricks and releases that you do, the further you're stepping away from the traditional application of the weapon, right? And so it was rather controversial when we made the decision to go ahead and go for it and see how the judges responded to it. And ultimately, the judges responded well. They recognized that this was a new way of showing difficulty that still used the weapon. So unlike people who were holding their weapons and doing tricking and finding difficulty that way, I was actually using the weapon that I was also striking and doing the traditional skills with. I was using that weapon to show difficulty in my creative and in my extreme routines. And that was the thing that kind of opened the door for me to become successful and develop a reputation. I'm a firm believer that a lot of people can be really good at what they do and they can win. But if you want to be remembered for what you do, you have to change the way that it's done, right? So I want to restate that again to make sure that's clear, right? You can be really, really good at doing things that people have done before, and you can win that way. But if you want to have a lasting legacy in whatever it is that you do in life, regardless of sport or if it's martial arts or whatever, if you want to have a lasting impact, you've got to be a trailblazer. You've got to do something that people have not done before. And that always involves a level of risk. Like I talked about, the decision to do the number of bow tricks that I was doing being pretty controversial. And so I took that risk. I made the jump. The judges liked it for the reasons that I described. And I started winning. And not only did I start winning, I started winning really consistently. And it was this new style that people hadn't seen before. And that's where some of the international intrigue came, where I was getting opportunities to fly all over the country and ultimately all over the world to teach seminars. Naturally, from the seminar business, the hyper pro athlete thing made sense. And if you want, we can go in more detail about how all of that worked. But all of this kind of fast tracked up until being 16, when Century gave me a call, and Century was interested in doing an endorsement deal for martial arts weapons. So I like to liken this to how basketball players have a signature shoe. That was basically the pitch that Century gave me, is no different than, like, I'm a Celtics fan. So I'll say Jason Tatum has his signature Jordan shoe, right? Jackson can have a signature Century bow, right? And I thought that was the coolest thing in the world. And we made it happen, put pen to paper, and we're still selling signature series bows to this day. And depending on when this drops, we've got some new models that are going to be coming into production. We're working on some of the prototypes right now, so I'm super excited about that. And it's been a really special relationship that I've had with Century. So a very long-winded answer to kind of go through that whole story and kind of how you go from being given a bow to all of a sudden being known for it. But that's the long and the short of it.
Yeah, because I first heard about you was when Roland Osborne came and visited my school, and he told my friend and I, his name is Dylan, and he said to me specifically, which one of you does bostaff? And Dylan and I looked at each other, we're like, neither of us, we don't do weapons. And he's like, well, you're going to do commas and you're going to do bostaff. So I was the guy with the comma. So then I was watching like Mackenzie and all of them as like my idols. And then Dylan, like right around COVID, he got hooked on your videos, especially with the flow system. He was sitting there just grinding it, and I would like visit him and I would like text him, FaceTime him, and he would always say like, dude, I'm so busy. I got to like lock this move out because I keep on dropping it or hitting my head with it. And I'm like, which one? It's like, it's the one that you throw up in the air, you spin 3 times, and hopefully you catch it. And then I'm like, dude, that sounds so cool. It's like, bro, it's so hard. He makes it look so easy. But that was the one thing that what I love about like hyper martial arts is that it takes it to another level. Like, can you go and take the risk deviating from like the regular like 540 or the 720 kick or like an inverted comma roll or like a figure 8, like going off on your own and just dropping the mic, be like, hey, this is what I can do. Speaking of that, how did you come across Paul Mitchell, like that team and organization and the whole grand scheme of things moving forward from that moment?
Well, first, you bring up Roland Osborne, and I want to take a quick moment to give Roland Osborne his flowers, because the sport karate industry would not look the way that it does today without what Roland did with Hyper. And Hyper's brand has transformed a lot in recent years. They've shifted more away from a focus on the pro athletes, and now they're more like in the schools and kind of maintaining the community that they've already built, which it seems like Roland's having a lot of success with that. I wish him all the success in the world with it. It's just a different direction than when I was a teenager and first getting involved with Hyper. But what Roland did for us professional sport karate athletes as 16, 17-year-olds is he gave us a platform where martial arts schools could find us to then book us for seminars and private lessons and things like that. Before Hyper came around, it was, if you were the absolute best in the sport, you were maybe teaching a handful of seminars a year. But for me, as a 16-year-old, I was teaching upwards of 35 to 40 seminars a year on a good year, right? And a lot of that was because of what Hyper's business model did and the way that they kind of shifted the thinking about sport karate seminars to be something that could be a recurring retention event for martial arts schools. And so I have to give Hyper a lot of credit for kind of laying the foundation where now martial arts athletes today, I mean, you could be the 5th or 6th seed on NASKA and you're teaching seminars here and there. You know what I mean? And that all of that comes from kind of that innovation that Hyper had to make seminars more of an industry standard type of deal. And I mentioned kind of the transformation of Hyper. a lot of that has to do with COVID and the fact that seminars were really not a big deal during COVID for obvious reasons. And so the industry kind of changes with the rest of the world in that way. But anyway, I just wanted to give that quick shout out since you brought up Hyper and Roland specifically. But transitioning to talking about Paul Mitchell and how I got involved with them. I knew about Paul Mitchell long before Paul Mitchell knew about me. So when I went to my first U.S. Open in 2006, that's when I decided that Team Paul Mitchell was the team that I wanted to represent, because it seemed like every single person that was on stage winning these prestigious U.S. Open championships were people representing Paul Mitchell. And I was like, okay, I got to be on that team because that team has all the best people. And it would turn out that as I learned more about the history, that's kind of the whole point of Paul Mitchell, is that, they've been around longer than anybody else and they're the most prestigious team. And the way that they function in the sport today is they want to recruit all of the people who are the absolute best. It is an accomplishment just to get on Paul Mitchell. It's not like, you get an opportunity to represent a team and then your accomplishments or what you do on the team. You have to accomplish so much before you even think about getting a phone call from Paul Mitchell, that can be one of the major accomplishments of your career in and of itself, which makes it that much more difficult after you're wearing the uniform, after you're on the team. You almost have to redefine yourself and find a whole new level that you can take it to. And so that was the standard that I wanted to hold myself to. So I made the goal of mine early on to one day represent Paul Mitchell. 4 years after that first U.S. Open. So in 2010, I made stage at the U.S. Open for the first time and won my first title there. Unfortunately, was not on Paul Mitchell yet, but I didn't have the resume to be on Paul Mitchell yet. It wouldn't be until 2011 I had a really good season. I think I competed in 14 events in 2011 and won 12 overall grand championships. I'm pretty sure was the stat line. So a very, very good season. The only losses that I took, I think I dropped at one tournament and had a stumble in the semifinals of another that ultimately held me back from being able to win those. But it was that type of a statistically dominant season where midway through the following year in 2012, at the U.S. Open, actually, that's when the Paul Mitchell coaching staff gave me the call and invited me to join the team. And that was a dream come true. And 48 hours after getting the phone call, I was on stage competing at the U.S. Open in the Night of Champions. So really, really special thing to be a part of the Paul Mitchell family. Over the years, there's been so many icons of sport karate that have represented the team, and it's so humbling to be now an alumni of Paul Mitchell, and have done everything that I can to write my own chapter in that long textbook that is the history of Paul Mitchell.
So you kind of mentioned earlier, you had that first grade teacher that basically introduced you to like martial arts in general. Then you had Roland Osborne, and then you have like the Team Paul Mitchell organization. What is the main piece of advice that you would tell people if they want to at least achieve to somewhat to that level of accomplishments in martial arts?
Well, I'll speak about this specifically for martial arts, but I think that this principle also expands to every aspect of life. I think the thing that helped me most to kind of go from just being a kid in a Taekwondo class to being somebody that has a name in the martial arts industry as a whole. I think the biggest thing is I never let anybody tell me that a dream was too big, right? And I think it's obvious how that applies to every aspect of life and not just the martial arts. But truthfully, at every step of the way, when I was a yellow belt, my parents wanted to pull me out of classes because I looked lost out there. And they were right. I did look lost out there. I don't doubt them at all. I was not a prodigy of a martial artist, but I loved it. So I kept doing it. And I already had the dream to one day be really, really good at it. So even though my own parents, and my parents have been super supportive, this was not mom and dad saying, hey man, you suck. My mom and dad have always been super supportive. They were realistic, right? It was realistic for them to be like, hey, you looks lost out there. Let's try something else. Let's try baseball or something, right? And there's nothing wrong with them being realistic. But as the athlete, as the martial artist, as the dreamer, I had to tell myself, no, it is realistic. I can be the best at this because I love it. I want to keep doing it, right? And that same trend continues throughout my life, really. I mean, when it came to being a high school student in a graduating class of less than 200 people and wanting to go to Stanford and submitting my college application. There were plenty of advisors and friends and plenty of people that are like, hey, you know, you're probably not getting into Stanford, right? But that was the dream. And I refused to believe that it wasn't realistic, right? And so I submitted the application and, you know, the good Lord blessed me. And next thing I know, I'm going to Stanford, right? It's the same thing with medical school. It's the same thing with getting on Paul Mitchell. It's the same thing with, you know, setting whatever wins record at whatever tournament. At every step of the way, I just told myself there's no such thing as impossible. If you can dream it, you can achieve it. And it brings me back. It's funny, the overlap here, because the U.S. Open is always held at Disney's Coronado Springs Resort. And one of my favorite quotes about this topic is a Walt Disney quote, which is, "It's kind of fun to do the impossible." And I think throughout my life, there's been so many things that people would tell you, and justifiably so, that that's impossible. There's no way that that can happen. But I firmly believe that if you believe in yourself enough and you put your faith in our Lord and Savior and just continue to keep fighting the good fight and put the work in, everything's going to turn out all right for you. And that's why I believe that any dream is achievable.
That's so inspirational, especially coming from you, because I've looked up to you for so long. And funny enough, I'm going to Palo Alto tomorrow. So that's kind of coincidental. You brought up Stanford. You were kind of mentioning that it was that big dream you just never thought was too big. Like you can always get that dream and that basically reach that. How did you go from I can do this to I must do this? Like I'm assuming that had to make a mindset shift at a certain point that you were probably thinking initially like, can I actually do this? And then it became I must do this. It kind of like walk me through the decision process.
Yeah, the transition from I can do this to I must do this, I think largely was a result of my competitiveness, right? And my dad will tell you, I was as competitive as can be, even when I wasn't very good, right? Like I remember showing up to tournaments that I was probably going to place dead last. But in my naive 8-year-old mind, I thought that I was going to win first place, right? Dre Rice is the name that I always like to drop because Dre Rice beat my butt back and forth when we were in the underbelts and then like as a 9 and under black belt. Dre Rice was just that guy. He was on straight up. He had a swag to him when he competed. He did an awesome comma form to Soldier Boy back in the day. So like Dre Rice was like the guy when we were in the 9 and under division. And I mean, he beat me left and right, man. And but every single tournament I went to, I was like, no, I'm going to win this time, right? And so as a competitor, that was something that was just part of who I am, was that I always think that I've got a shot, right? And I think a lot of that comes from my dad, obviously, you know, lived through the 90s when the Chicago Bulls were going on their tear. And my dad is a huge Michael Jordan fan. And so there's no doubt in my mind that the kind of Michael Jordan competitiveness is something that my dad instilled in me from an early age, which is probably where some of that comes from. But I think that, you know, the transition to I must do this, that feeling of an obligation to be successful, I think that really didn't come for me until I was in the adult division. I can remember a specific phase in my career. So I mentioned that first U.S. Open win back in 2010. I was a kid. You know, at that point, I was 12 years old. It would have been a dream come true to win one junior U.S. Open title. Like that, I could have retired at that point and been totally happy, right? And then obviously win the next year, get on Paul Mitchell in 2012, win it again, and then win it one more time when I was, I guess it would have been, 16? So I win the U.S. Open for the fourth consecutive year when I was 16. And I wound up losing in 2015. Actually, no, let me make sure I get this right. Win 2013, lost in 2014, came back and won in 2015. The reason that all of this matters is because when I won the fourth consecutive U.S. Open title, that was a tie for the most ever, right? Jim and DeWin had done it as a junior. Casey Marks Nash had done it, I believe, as an adult. And Cal Menchoka had obviously done it as an adult. And obviously to be on a list with those people, me being the second person with Gemma to do it as a junior, That was super cool. But nobody at any age level had ever won 5 consecutive individual U.S. Open weapons titles. And so when I was going for that 5th in a row and I came up short, I wound up losing on a 4-3 split, literally 9.99, one judge away from having that all-time record. I think that was a huge moment for me as a career reset, right? Because you look at that, and at the time, I accepted that was never going to happen again. At that point, I had 1 more year left as a junior, and then I was going to be going up to the adult division. And in the adult division, everybody knows that the competition is more stiff and it's harder to win. And so I kind of accepted at that point when I lost that first attempt going for 5 straight. I kind of accepted, like, okay, I'm never going to win 5 straight. Like that's the end of that goal, right? And so I wind up winning my last year as a junior in 2015, and then I lose again in 2016. And then 2017 is when I kind of start a streak again at the U.S. Open. And 2017 is where I would say the transition from I can to I must happened. Because 2017, obviously coming off of the loss in my rookie year as an adult at the U.S. Open, the tournament that I cared about more than any other. And I won a Warrior Cup my first year as an adult. So it's not like I had a bad season in that rookie season. I still won a lot of overall grand championships, but it was that title. It was that one that I wanted, right? And so being able to come back and get what I felt like was my title back in 2017 and get that first weapons win as an adult, really that's where the competitive switch was flipped. And I said, you know what? I can go on. I can get another 4 of these. Let's do it. Game on, right? And that's where it started to change. Like, no, I have to do this for my legacy, right? I already came up short going 4 in a row and not getting that 5th once. I can't let myself come up short again. I can't let the streak break again. And then, of course, won 2018, won the 2019 U.S. Open. And next thing you know, we have COVID. And the U.S. Open doesn't happen for a year. And at this point in the outside part of my life from martial arts, I'm graduating from Stanford and going to medical school. And I know that when it comes time to go to medical school, I'm going to have to hang up the uniform. Yes, I can still teach and I can still broadcast and do all this, but I'm not going to have the time to be a competitor. I'm not going to have the time to be the Jackson Rudolph as a bow competitor that I always saw myself as. And so, again, it felt like, well, the streak's over. That's it. Like 2020, there's no U.S. Open. This is it, right? And then 2021 comes around. I'm in my gap year before going to medical school. And the very last summer before medical school, literally, and for anybody that doesn't know, I wound up going to medical school in the Army. So I had to go to my Army commissioning course literally within like 2 or 3 weeks after the 2021 U.S. Open. And at that point, before the U.S. Open, I kind of thought, like, you know, I'm not going to compete at the Open this year. I got med school to focus on. And a few months before the U.S. Open, I said, you know what? One more ride. Let's do it. Because that one more ride would have given me a chance to win 4 in a row for the second time. And even though I knew that I wasn't going to wind up going for 5 in a row after that, if you had asked 15-year-old Jackson, would you rather have 5 in a row or would you rather get 4 in a row twice? 8's a lot better than 5. And so ultimately that's what happened. I trained and went to that 2021 U.S. Open, competed against an entirely new field of competitors. You know, a lot of my battles through the prime of my adult years were against Reed and Cole Presley and Tyler Weaver, and that's who I was sharing those battles with. So it was a little weird in 2021 when those were not my opponents anymore. That final in 2021 was all the new kids on the block. Their younger brother, Jake Presley, was in that division. I think Jake actually wound up being the runner-up for that U.S. Open title. And then, of course, would win titles of his own after that. Danny Edkin, Alex Mancias, and I'm probably forgetting people that were in that field with me because, as you can imagine, there were plenty of emotions flying through my brain that night. But it was very cool to get to compete against a new generation. Where it wasn't the same people that I'd always shared the mat with, and I got to finish my career with the highest of highs, and I'll forever be grateful for that.
there's just so much preparation that you just don't even think about that is just required and needed. How did you basically start to create a form from like, let's just see if this kind of goes together to I can win with this? Like, kind of walk me through the process of formulating a form to performing it and basically winning with it.
Form development is a very underrated part of what forms and weapons competitors do. Everybody sees the finished product and they see the finished product over and over again over the course of the season, but they don't realize how much strategy really goes into building what that form is. And I guess I might get a little controversial here, but I would say that from what I see in the sport, both when I was an active competitor and also being a fan of the sport now, and I guess an analyst of the sport, I honestly don't think that people make adjustments as often as they should, right? If you're winning every overall grand championship, no, you don't need to make any adjustments. Do you need to make sure that you're always staying one step ahead and you've always got something else up your sleeve? Absolutely. But you don't need to hit the panic button and start changing things up. But then there are some times where both when I was a competitor and watching now that I see somebody lose tournament after tournament, and they're good enough. They have the talent, they have the skills to be able to win some of these grand championships. But for some reason, people are resistant to making the adjustment. It's like whatever the system is broke, but they're not fixing it. Whereas the reverse of that, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? If you're winning, it ain't broke, don't fix it. But if you're losing, something's broke and you got to fix it. So I'll start by saying I think that people should change it up a little bit more often than they do currently, because I think sometimes people go on losing streaks that they don't necessarily have to go on if they would make the right adjustment here and there. But to answer your question generally about like how do you actually develop the form, I think the first thing you have to start with is you have to make sure you have an appropriate amount of basics in your form. I can't tell you how often I've seen somebody bust out onto the scene and have some early success because they have this special trick they can do that nobody's ever seen before, or because maybe their vertical jumping ability is out of this world and so that blows everybody away. They've got something that makes them unique. But inevitably what happens is if they don't have a solid foundation or they don't show it off enough in their form with their basics, then after 3 or 4 tournaments, that hype is going to fade and they're going to find themselves not able to win anymore. So if you want sustained success, you have to start with a solid foundation. You have to build from the basics. So making sure your best striking combinations are built into the form, making sure that you're hitting good stances to complement those striking combinations. All of the things that your traditional martial arts instructor is going to grill you about, those are the things that actually make the most tangible difference between winning and losing. And then after that, all of the strategy with tricks comes into play. And there is a great deal of strategy with tricks, right? And I think that every winning form at a NASKA overall grand championship or a world championship level, every form has to have at least 2 different kinds of tricks. You have to have obvious difficulty. You have to have some move in that form that a chimpanzee could tell, okay, that was harder than what that guy did, right? For me, it was in the opening section of my form doing a triple spin, right? Sometimes it would be a double that was kind of depending upon some strategy and what my competitors were doing. But at my highest level, I was doing a triple spin in the opening, probably 15 seconds of my routine. And that was me saying, I'm going to throw my bow up, I'm going to spin a bunch of times, and I'm going to catch it clean. And it's going to be really obvious that that's really hard to do, right? The other type of trick that you have to be successful is you have to have something that nobody's ever seen before, right? For those of you that haven't watched me before, the Chris Angel is a move that I started doing all the way back in 2013, where I would throw the bow up horizontally from behind my back and catch the bow on the back of my hand. Now, if you're a fan of sport karate now, you're like, yeah, I see every 9-year-old do that. What do you mean? Like, how's that cool, right? But in 2013, it's a different time. And when I came up with that move, nobody could figure it out for a good 6 months or so. Like, nobody could figure out how. Like, I can't tell you how many times I would teach a seminar, I'd be talking to people at a tournament, and people would be like, okay, but you have like a magnet in your bow, right? Or you've got something that like you've got like sticky stuff on your hand, right? Like, how are you actually making it stick there? And so when the move first came out, it was something that people legitimately did not understand how I was doing it. And that's what gave me an edge over everybody else. And I'll be honest, A Chris Angel's not harder than a triple spin. It's relatively easy to do once you understand how to do it. And so that second type of trick that you have to have, it's not about how hard the trick is to do, but it's about how cool does it look? Is it something that people are impressed by that they haven't seen before? Is it something that changes the way that people feel about your form overall, right? And I think that you can look back through history and find individual examples of a lot of the great champions having something like that. For Kalman Choka, it was simply the fact that he did double sword. And people were like, he's doing double sword, right? For Matt Emig, there's a couple of Matt Emig signature moves, like wrapping the chucks together or doing the chuck throw and then wrapping it around his body and then catching the other chuck again. Like, you can name any weapons champion, and I'll tell you some of these moves that stood out and made them different. But you need that if you want to win at that highest level. So to summarize, focus on the basics first, because you don't have a chance if the basics aren't there. Then you need two other types of things in the form, two other releases. One of them needs to be obvious difficulty, and the other needs to be something that people haven't seen before.
That's a good point, because I used to say it has to have more style points. Like, is there any like pizzazz? And we kind of mess around with that, because I used to teach a lot when I was in high school. And I would always tell someone, like, if you watch like Jackson Rudolph, Mackenzie, anyone, look at all the oohs and ahs, that's what he's looking for. Like, whoa, and that sort of thing. And I kind of find it funny when people say, like, that's so hard to do. It's like, well, you can learn it yourself now. So let's get going. How did you prepare for these major competitions? Like, I remember watching a live stream of yours, I want to say before COVID, I don't know when, at the Battle of Atlanta. Like, how did you walk in there all confident and not so like nervous or antsy or like, oh, that's the guy I saw last time, he's really good? Like, how do you keep that like macho face, like that game on face?
If you bring that presence, that the big thing on social media now is aura, right? If you bring that aura too early, it very quickly gets received as arrogance and cockiness, right? If you're somebody that has not been there, done that within the sport, and you show up to your first tournament, walking with your shoulders back and everything, it's not going to be received well, right? People are not going to be receptive to that unless you happen to be that guy. If you're him, right, and you can back it up, then maybe it'll work out for you. But most of the time, when you first show up, you're not ready for that yet. And so, people ask, like, well, how do you bring that to the ring? And my answer would be, nobody should just start trying to bring that to the ring, right? You have to kind of earn the right to walk the walk that way, if you will, right? And so I would say, if you're somebody that's trying to get your first win and you just want to walk into the ring with confidence, the best thing that you can practice is having a stone face, having a poker face, right? Because it's those people that are emotionally steady, always respectful, their emotions never swing too high or too low. It's those people that are able to kind of weather the storm of kind of taking those early punches, those early losses when you start traveling the circuit. And then ultimately, your performances do the talking, and then you start to generate a bit of that swagger. You develop a reputation. And the next thing you know, if you're winning and winning and winning, then all of a sudden you become the guy that people look around the ring and go, he's here. Like, it just got real. That guy showed up, right? And so I don't think that anybody should walk into their first tournament or their first 15 tournaments trying to bring that level of a swagger and a macho presence to your form. But once you reach that level, I think that there's a huge part of judge psychology that goes underrated, right? If you want the judges to watch you and immediately associate you with being the winner, then you've got to act like that from the moment the judges first lay eyes on you, which is not when you step in the ring. The judges are at the ring watching warm-ups. So the way you warm up, the way that you show up to the ring, the way that you listen to music and get in the zone, the way that you carry yourself, you need to carry yourself like you're the best in the world if you're somebody at that level trying to separate yourself from the pack. Because at any given time, there's 5, 6, 7 people that are at that level, right? If you look at the men's weapons division right now, there's at least 5 people that legitimately have a chance to win an overall grand championship in men's CMX weapons, creative musical extreme, right? So the field is always going to have multiple people that can win. But the person that will win is the person that does the best job of convincing the judges that they're that guy. And that starts long before the division ever starts. So don't show up to your first tournament or your first season of competing thinking that if you try to carry yourself with that swagger, then that's going to make you a champion. Your performances are what's going to make you a champion. And then once you reach that level, the way that you make it consistent and the way that you develop a following and get the crowd to get behind you is then you've got to learn how to own the ring. And owning the ring starts long before your form does.
That's interesting. And I kind of did like a little bit of research into you. You won over 50 world championships, which is like super impressive. What is a specific tournament or a specific time of year that really sticks out to you that you're like, this is like peak, I'm going to destroy, and you did that, you followed through? Like, what was like a major moment in your tricking career, in your martial arts career, really, that really stands out to you?
Oh, for me, it was always U.S. Open, and I'll talk a little bit about the timeline of how or how I would navigate through a competition season on NASKA. Because at the end of the day, the biggest NASKA title you can win, and this is why when people say, "Oh, well, how many world championships do you have?" The God's honest truth is, I have no idea what the actual number is, because on NASKA, in every division you do, if you happen to accumulate the most points for the season, then they call you a world champion. And so it becomes, once you reach a certain level, it's relatively easy to amass some ridiculous number that sounds totally outrageous, which is why, like, yes, sure, it's over 50 or whatever, but I don't try to publicize that number too much, because it's like, to me, that number doesn't mean a whole lot. To me, what means a whole lot is focusing on those major championships. And so the point that I was making was on NASKA, the highest NASKA honor that you can have is being the overall world champion, which doesn't mean that you won your division the most times for the course of the year. It means that overall grand championship, the highest honor at a given tournament, you won that the most times over the course of the year. You won that more than anybody else. So that's the highest NASKA honor you can achieve. So for me, going into a season, the goal was always fourfold. Win the most overalls, so you can be the NASKA overall world champion, because that's the one that for me actually mattered, right? Win the Warrior Cup, win the U.S. Open, win a diamond ring, okay? And so it's literally one overall title and then single out the tournaments that I want to be my best at, right? And so Warrior Cup was always the first tournament of the season. And even though I always, spent the whole off season trying to put together the strategy that was going to help me win another Warrior Cup, I never felt polished at Warrior Cup. I felt ready. I felt ready to go out there and do everything I could to win a Warrior Cup, and was very blessed to be able to pull that off 7 times. But when I go back and I look at my U.S. Open forms compared to a Warrior Cup form from that same year, I see so many things that I changed from January to July, from Warrior Cup to U.S. Open. So yes, I was focused on making myself really hard to beat at Warrior Cup. But, fate of the universe on the line, I would not put Warrior Cup Jackson Rudolph against U.S. Open Jackson Rudolph. And I think a big part of that was that in that time period between Warrior Cup and U.S. Open, those other tournaments, which depending on the season was anywhere from 4 to 6 additional tournaments, I was using all of that to collect more data, right? So Warrior Cup was like the first run of that new concept for the form that I was going to try. And then win or lose those next 4, 5, 6 tournaments was tweaking little things. How do I score differently if I do this in section 1? How do I score differently if I make this variation by ending? How do I score differently if I use this song compared to this other song, right? And I was collecting data throughout all of those other tournaments. And so by the time you get to U.S. Open, we've got my Warrior Cup peak, and then I'm kind of in the lab tweaking things, working, trying to win as much as I can. But then I've essentially optimized the form that I have by the time we get to U.S. Open, because the entire purpose for me was to get to U.S. Open and win that, because that's the one time a year that we get to be on ESPN. So if you're going to be the guy, you got to be the guy when the most people are watching, right? And so that's why I always kind of catered my training to U.S. Open. And unfortunately, that worked out for me. And then for diamonds, it's not like I would win the U.S. Open and then take it easy for the rest of the year. That certainly isn't what happened. But as a bow competitor, I was very dependent upon my releases. And Diamonds has always had their night finals on a stage that is relatively close to the ceiling, with a big chandelier that overhangs part of the stage. And so for me, people talk about like Federer having to play Nadal on clay, right? And how Nadal was a master of playing on clay. The environment for me was kind of like Federer playing on clay, right? Where I could win it, I could still be Jackson, but I didn't feel like myself because I was always having to calculate around. Okay, the chandelier is on the left side of the stage this year, so I've got to account for that. And there was just more to the environment that I had to take into account that I didn't have to at U.S. Open. That made Diamonds a little bit more difficult for me to win on average. But at the same time, I was still able to add diamond rings to my resume, and very fortunate to have been able to have done that. And in retrospect, do I wish that I would have made maybe a more drastic strategy change for Diamonds? That probably would have been wise. But on the other hand, I look back and I say, well, there were 2 times at Diamonds that I went for big strategy change, and then I dropped and then didn't have a chance at the ring anyway, right? So, that's part of what happens when you kind of focus your whole season on winning the U.S. Open. But I don't regret that strategy at all, really.
When you were competing at Diamonds, were you more concerned on the environment, like as itself, like physically, or you're more concerned on, is what I'm doing enough to like suffice? Like you're saying that like when Federer and Nadal are on clay, like there's that little bit of unevenness. Like how did you get over that, or how did you kind of just be like screw it, let's just do it?
For sure.
You know what I mean?
And I think if you listen to me in a lot of interviews, I talk about how I was very cerebral with regard to matchups, right? I was going to edit my form. And a lot of weapons competitors will not tell you this. A lot of weapons competitors, this is my plan. I'm sticking to it. I'm going to execute. I'm competing against myself. I have never been a compete against myself guy. The judges don't score me against myself. The judges score me against who's in the ring with me. So I'm very big on strategizing for your competitors. And so at 90% of all tournaments, you would hear me talk about how, Reed Presley was doing this, so I decided to do this, or Cole Presley had this new thing, so I decided to switch it up with this. That was true at 90% of tournaments. But Diamonds, I almost never thought about my competitors. Diamonds was almost always thinking about, okay, where can I do this trick to make sure that I'm not under the chandelier here? Even when I'm not under the chandelier, do I have room to triple if I'm in this part of the stage? So to answer your question, Diamonds always felt like it was more me against the environment and trying to figure out the best way to show off my best stuff given the ceiling limitations. Whereas other tournaments, the environment was an afterthought. I tried to take that out of it completely, and I was just focused on who I was competing against. Diamonds certainly was different.
What's kind of nice in your scenario, and I had this myself when I was competing, you go against generally the same people over and over. So you kind of have like an expectation on like, oh, I saw him like a couple months ago. He was doing this last time I saw him. Let's see what he's doing lately. When you were competing, when was like the tipping point that was like the aha moment that you were like, okay, like I got this now, like moving forward? Because for me specifically, I was a little bit weary because I was like, yeah, I have like a decent sidekick when I spar. Like I can do a pretty good sidekick and land it on their stomach. But I wasn't totally sure until I kept on seeing it over and over and over that it was working. Like when did that moment kick in that, oh, this works? This is like my secret sauce, essentially.
I think the answer is twofold. I think that I first noticed that my style, my concept for how I wanted to do bow, I first knew that was going to work the tournament that I debuted it at. And what's funny is I didn't win the tournament that I debuted that style at. And again, this is me as a 12-year-old at the Lone Star Open in 2010 in Austin, Texas, which is where I debuted this concept of linking bow tricks together. But I remember Joe Greenhall, who's the owner of G-Force Weapons, the former promoter of the New England Open. We're hoping he brings that back sometime soon. And generally, Joe is a widely respected sport karate legend. Everybody in the community knows Joe Greenhall and respects Joe Greenhall. So he was my center judge. And the first time that I ran that form, I actually dropped in the last section. But because it was the last section, you had seen the full form play out leading up to that. And I remember when I dropped, again, 12-year-old, Joe Greenhall clapped his hands and cursed as the center judge when I dropped. And when my dad and I noticed that he did that, I came off the mat and we kind of looked at each other and we were like, we got some. We've got some, right? And so the next division comes around, I hit my form and Joe gives me a 10. And I'm like, we definitely got something, right? And so ultimately, I go on to the runoffs, which is the semifinals on the NASKA circuit, and I wind up having a stumble, and so I lose. And so, like, I had a drop and a stumble that knocked me out of the semifinal, and I lost the first tournament trying the concept. But the reaction of that trusted, respected center judge, my dad and I were like, okay, we've got proof of concept. And so really from that moment is where I was like, oh yeah, it's game time. We can win now, right? Even as a 12-year-old. But admittedly, as a 12-year-old, it's like, okay, well, any 12-year-old that wins once can think that they've got it made, right? So I think that the second part of this, when I really started to believe that I could be dominant and that I could really leave an impact on this sport, probably came shortly after I got on Paul Mitchell. And it wasn't because I got on Paul Mitchell, but it was because by the time I got on Paul Mitchell, I had figured out the formula, right? I had multiple 5, 6, 7, 8 tournament win streaks. I was at a point where I could, if I wasn't messing up, if there wasn't a flaw with what I did, then typically I was winning the overall grand. And the biggest thing that I learned from that was that if you want to win more than anybody else, you've got to give yourself more chances to win than anybody else. And as a weapons competitor, that means you just got to hit your form, right? I see so many like top competitors over the years, both when I was competing, before I was competing, now, even today, that they're amazing at what they do, but their catch percentage is in like the low 60s, right? They're only hitting like a little over half the forms that they're doing. And if you're only finishing that many forms, you're cutting your opportunities to win in half. And so for me, something that I always emphasized in my training was I'm going to rep these tricks such that it should shock people if I drop, right? And a lot of my competitors, I've watched interviews, they talk about that. They're like, yeah, when you're game planning for anybody else, you recognize there's a chance that they drop and then your game plan changes. But when you were training to compete against Jackson, you knew he wasn't going to drop. And that's one of the things that I pride myself, like, to hear my competitors say that is the biggest compliment that you could ever give me, right? Because in some ways, hearing competitors say that, I know that I have a mental edge, right? I'm going into a tournament where I'm human. I totally could drop. But if I have been so consistent that my competitors don't even believe it's possible, that they don't even consider the fact that it could happen, I already have an edge over everybody that I'm competing against, right? In addition to the fact that statistically speaking, I've got a better chance to win because I've got a better chance to hit my form, right? And so I would say by the time I got on Paul Mitchell, I figured that out and I said, okay, we're going to do really hard stuff and we're going to hit the really hard stuff the vast majority of the time that we do it. I think that it was really a game changer for me. And my dad, I give a ton of credit to my dad throughout this podcast. You probably noticed that. But my dad kept a spreadsheet my whole career. And so we actually have the data. We have the stats. And for my career, I have like a 91% catch rate across every form that I ever did. And the fact that I could get that catch rate up over 90%, I'm a firm believer that was a huge element of enabling my success.
That's such a flex, low key. Like my catch rate on like releases with a comma is like around 45-ish. And I'm like, I need to work on that. And you're motivating me to do that, which is great.
For sure. And by the way, don't get me wrong. Like, I think a 40 to 60% catch rate is what like the vast majority of competitors have. Because we compete in a sport today where people have to do really hard stuff to be competitive. And so people try to do really hard stuff before they're really ready for it. And so for your average, good competitors that are out there traveling the circuit, it's not uncommon for people to, at a low point, have like a 40% catch rate, and at a high point, have like a 60% catch rate. The guys who have a reputation, and girls, who have a reputation for being really consistent in the game right now, it doesn't have to be plus 90%. I mean, if you're hitting your form 75 to 80% of the time, that's not a C plus or a B minus. That is a high level of consistency in the sport today. Is my recommendation for people to always try to get in the 90s? Absolutely. But when I say that, I'm not saying that is an expectation for anybody. I'm very, very humbled and very fortunate that my hard work paid off in that way. But by no means am I saying that, oh, well, in order to be good, you got to be catching at least 90%. That's not that don't get that twisted.
When did you really realize that every martial artist starts traditional, in my basic understanding? Like everyone kind of starts just like, oh, you learn how to do a jab, a cross, a snap kick, a side kick, whatever. How do you distinct, or what are like the distinguishes between a tricker and a traditional martial arts from your perspective? Like what can you see the differences between them?
I think that a lot of it depends on what you fall in love with early on, right? Like for me, even though I wasn't a tricker, I identified that that's what I related to more. I identified that like those are the people that I was a fan of, right? And I tell people all the time, one of my favorite sport karate competitors ever was John Su, who was most known for being a traditional forms competitor. Although he was a master of all trades, he could do soft style, he could do extreme weapons, but that's beside the point. He was most known as a traditional forms competitor. He's one of my all-time favorites. But most of my favorite competitors were all extreme stylists. And so I think that is what kind of predisposed me to want to do the extreme stuff more, even though I had more early success with traditional. And, similarly, I think that people who, that all of their favorite competitors are traditionalists when they first come out on the circuit, I think that predisposes them to focus more on the traditional part of their training with regard to their competitive career, right? And another part of it, I also think is skill set, right? I'm a firm believer that, everybody has God-given gifts that they're blessed with, and that hard work can take those gifts to another level. And I think that for some people, their gifts are more better suited to traditional. And for some people, their gifts are more better suited to extreme, right? My wife, Gabrielle, is a great example of this. Gabrielle was on AKA, which is historically known as a more extreme slanted team, even though they've got some great traditionalists too. But she was on AKA for most of her competitive career. She was competing in extreme forms for the majority of her career, leading up to really becoming an adult, right? And so all the signs would be pointing to, okay, well, yeah, if Gabrielle's ever going to be good, she's going to be an extreme stylist. But ultimately, once she started competing more in traditional, she started working with a traditional coach, and that unlocked, wait a minute, my gifts, my body type, the way that I move, it better aligns with being a traditionalist. And that's where her career did a complete 180-degree pivot, that she wound up being a fantastic traditionalist, right? And so some of it is based on kind of what you grow up looking up to, what you aspire to be. But another big part of it is as you grow as an athlete, you learn what your God-given gifts are, and you learn how to best mobilize those. And that's why I think every junior competitor should do everything. If you're a junior competitor, you should be doing traditional divisions, you should do extreme divisions, you should even try point fighting, because you never know what is going to be the thing that winds up writing your legacy as an adult competitor. Another great example right now is a guy like Mason Bumbo, who's on top 10 Team USA, and he can still lay down a great bow form. But as a junior, he was known as a bow guy. Like, that is the thing that got him publicity. He's won Warrior Cups with it. Like, Mason Bumbo was known as a bow guy, but now you look at the way that he's redefined his career as an adult. Like I said, he can still throw down a good bow form, but the primary thing he seems to be focused on now is point fighting, right? And he was always point fighting as a junior. Even when he was on stage winning as a bow competitor, he kept point fighting as a junior. And it's a perfect example of, if you're under the age of 18, you should be doing a little bit of everything, because you never know what that thing that is going to be your adult career, you never know what that's going to be.
When you were kind of explaining all these major, I want to say like role models, like you mentioned, from that first instructor to right now with who you're working with, how do you want to be remembered?
Another heavy. I think that late in my career, I thought a lot about how I wanted to be remembered. Because at the end of the day, as a high-level sport karate competitor, that's really the only reason we do it, is to be remembered, right? As a professional sport karate competitor, you don't make a whole lot of money. You could go undefeated for the season, and your net worth of your winnings would be like 15 grand, right? Which is great. Like I'm happy to take 15 grand, but that's not making a living for anybody, right? And that is being completely dominant, like winning the overall at every single NASKA tournament, and you come out with 15 grand, right? So nobody's doing this to make a living and not just be rich. Nobody's doing it to make a living, period, right? You're not doing it for fame, because I think we all admit that at this time, sport karate is kind of an underground, like, there's a community, if you consider friends and family and people that watch it peripherally, there's a community of maybe, a few 100,000 people, right? That with just from connections to the sport karate community, that they're going to know who you are. You'll be a household name if you're the absolute best to maybe a few 100,000 people, right? Which in the grand scheme of things is not fame, right? And so it's not for money, it's not for fame. So like that's the reason professional athletes do what they do, right? You play in the NBA, you're rich and famous. Like these are the benefits of being a pro athlete, right? So as a sport karate competitor, you're not doing it for any of that. You're really doing it for the love of the game. And when it comes to what you get from it, other than the love of the game, you really just want to be remembered by the people who come after you, right? The same way that I talk about Mike Bernardo and Casey Marks and Corey Lutkus as Bo legends, the same way that I talk about Kalman Choka, Matt Imig, Steve Tirada, Carmichael Simon, Mike Chat, John Valera, I could rattle these names off forever. The same way that I talk about those guys is the way that I hope that the young competitors of today would talk about me. That, I grew up watching videos of Jackson on YouTube, and that's the reason that I wanted to do this. And I think that since I retired from competition, that still remained the goal of I want to be remembered for what I did as an athlete. But post-retirement, a lot of what I've been focused on is just trying to make the sport a better place for people who come after, right? And the reason I say that is because I am immeasurably blessed by the opportunities that the sport gave. I firmly believe that I would not have had the opportunity to go to Stanford if not for my career as a sport karate competitor. I certainly believe that my career as a sport karate competitor set me apart with med school applications. And so I think that for all of the endeavors that I will pursue in life ahead of me, the fact that I became a great sport karate competitor made those things possible. However, I dedicated so much time and made so many sacrifices and did so much to reach that level in sport karate that I personally feel that people who come after me that put in that same amount of work and make those same sacrifices should be able to have that be the only thing that they do, right? Just like any other professional sport, that if you pour all of yourself into basketball, your goal is to make it to the NBA and make a career. If you pour all of yourself into football, you're going to the NFL and you're making it a career, right? I want to create a future where if you pour all of yourself into sport karate, then you can do sport karate as your career. Not do sport karate to help you get into college, although if you still go to college, that's awesome. I fully support that, right? Because I did, right? But not just using sport karate to then one day do glory kickboxing, karate combat, UFC, whatever, right? Other full contact sports if you're a point fighter. So I don't want sport karate to always just be, oh, well, I did sport karate so that I can take this step. It shouldn't always be a stepping stone. This is a sport that is extremely spectator friendly. There is no other sport like sport karate that can give you the three-ring circus that we give you of the traditional martial arts and an appreciation for the basics and solid technique, of the extreme martial arts and the things that you see at the X Games that'll make you sit back in your chair and be like, oh my gosh, how do they do that? And to bring you combat sports where you're watching elite strikers test their skills to see who can hit the other person faster, right? And with a clean enough technique that all the judges can see it. There's no other sport that gives you that type of a variety act all in one show. And so as a spectator sport, Sport karate has everything that we need to be a mass media sport, to be something that people can be a fan of. That, like, I've never played organized basketball a day in my life, but I'm going to be watching the NBA Finals rooting for my Celtics, right? So sport karate can become that, where if you've never done martial arts a day in your life, you should be able to tune in and be like, I want that guy to win because I think he's crazy, right? I want that girl to win because I think her technique's the best, right? This is a sport that is possible, right? And so that's the reason that I have my own podcast. That's the reason that myself and my wife Gabrielle do Sport Karate Zone and try to bring sport martial arts to a broader audience. It's the reason that I do the commentating and broadcasting that I do at these tournaments, is because really I want my lasting legacy to not have anything to do with me. I want my legacy to allow the competitors of tomorrow to be able to reap so many more benefits from their sacrifice than what I was able to.
Yeah, I've been visiting my old studio when I was off in college. I came back and visited Maryland time to time, and I was just so happy that everyone got better, not just in martial arts, just as like a human being. Like they understand themselves, and that's like the beauty of martial arts. You're able to understand yourself, and I think the relationships are probably the best relationships you can have in the sport and in life. Like all my close friends are martial arts related, and you could probably resonate that with yourself as well. When you were in the mud of training, practicing, just doing repetitions, your instructor's yelling at you, making you doing push-ups, all that stuff. How do you value those relationships? Because you're either like all laughing about it or all like kind of heated at each other. We're like, okay, this is like game on. Like, kind of explain to me like your interaction and experience with relationships in martial arts.
Those relationships are everything. I mean, that is, we talk about, wanting to be remembered and wanting to leave a legacy, but from just a real life standpoint, the thing that I look back on and I'm most appreciative for from my martial arts career is the friends that were made along the way. I've talked a few times in this podcast already about my best competitors, Reed and Cole Presley, that duo of brothers that duked it out with me all the time, right? But even though on the mat we were rivals, we wanted to beat each other so bad, right? And the brothers didn't so much want to beat each other as they wanted to just beat me. That's beside the point. But those guys are my best friends. Reed was the best man at my wedding. Cole was a groomsman. Like these are people that mean a lot to me. I care deeply about those guys, and they care about me. And having that is something that is so valuable in this world. I think that it's so important in the world that we live in today to remember that every single person on earth has somebody that cares deeply about them. No matter who you are, where you come from, everybody has that person. And the fact that I had gained some of those people from the martial arts is something that I'm eternally grateful for. And it's not only your competitors, it's also your mentors along the way. Steve Babcock, one of the co-founders of Paul Mitchell, he was also a groomsman at my wedding. I've made countless trips to Narragansett, Rhode Island, not necessarily to do anything with karate, but just to go sailing with Steve. Because, even though he won't like me saying this, but even though he's like twice my age, he's still one of my best friends. You know what I mean? And he was initially a mentor, but from mentorship, a friendship was born, right? And I think that is something so powerful about the martial arts, is that from the core life values that the martial arts teaches and all of the sacrifices that we make along the way to do what we do, we form these bonds that will never be broken. And that's one of the most powerful things about this game and this life.
Yeah, I was gonna say I recently did jujitsu, and I felt that I was like the weird, like what is this? Like I'm not used to like being in a rear naked choke and arm bar, and then all my UFC like knowledge kicks in. I'm like, okay, it looks like this, right? They're like, no, you need more leverage, and then I'm like, oh, okay. Starting back from white belt. When did you feel that in life you had to go back to that white belt mindset? Like we have to start from scratch. Like when did martial arts become not just handy, but instrumental in your success outside of it?
It's a great question, but it's an easy answer. Day one of medical school. That was the most in my life that I had felt like, okay, it is back to white belt, and we're going to build from the ground up here. Because one thing that, and I guess we're shifting from a karate podcast here to a med school podcast briefly, which we're going to talk about this. I have to say that my opinions are my own and my statements do not reflect that of the U.S. Army, my medical school, or the Department of Defense. So with that disclaimer thrown out there, I think that one of the biggest things that martial arts helped me with in starting that medical school journey, and something that people don't talk about enough, is when you go from being a pre-med student in undergrad to being a first-year medical student, the types of content that you are learning is vastly different. You have like a month in which you're covering some of the biochemistry and the stuff like that is, the same stuff that you learned in undergraduate. But after you get through that initial like month or 2 month period of some biochemistry and all of that, once you get into like actually learning disease processes, taking care of patients, understanding pharmacology beyond biochemistry, like all of those things that ultimately you will put together to one day be a doctor, is so different from being able to tell like where the carbons go in a molecular structure, right? And so, I think that first year of medical school was a really beneficial reset button for me, where I realized like, hey, it's great that I learned all this stuff at Stanford, but now I've got to use this brain power and I've got to repurpose it in a brand new way. And I think that mindset and understanding what it feels like to be a white belt, understanding what it feels like to be a beginner, and humble yourself. Because I think it can be very, very easy for first year medical students to come in a little too cocky, right? Like, a lot of medical students come from these big prestigious schools, Stanford, Ivy League schools, stuff like that, right? And, you graduate with your big fancy degree, and then you get into medical school, which is an achievement in its own right, because it's extremely difficult, especially today, to get into medical school in the first place. And so I think it's easy for a lot of people to walk into medical school thinking, like, hey, I got my big fancy degree, I got into medical school, my foot's in the door, 4 years from now, I'm going to be a doctor, that like high on life, right? And I think that first year of medical school humbles everybody and kind of shows you like, no, you're going to be a beginner, and you're going to be a beginner real quick. And I think that my experience of having been a martial artist and having been a white belt definitely helped me kind of go into it with a mindset of humility and be ready to roll with the punches and learn something from the ground up.
You have no idea how many times I've tripped on the staff or like something bad happened. Like, is there anything you want to like debunk that you think that is just overly heard or too much emphasis on or anything?
Man, that's another good one. Kind of in a way asking for a bit of a hot take here with regard to training. I used to think, and I'm gonna bold and underline used to. I used to think that it was overrated when I would say, as a non-tricker, as somebody that's just focused on weapon striking and weapons tricks, not the actual acrobatics. I was somebody that always was like, oh, it's normal for me to do 10 reps of every section and then 10 full form reps and like the high volume reps of the forms that I was preparing for competition, which for me was a huge part of preparing my consistency so that I knew that I was going to hit my form when I went out there, right? And when I was younger and when I was naive about the way that trickers train, I would train with people who were tricking and obviously, high energy jumps multiple times throughout a form. And they would say, Jackson, we can't do that many reps. We will hurt ourselves. Like your legs give out and at a certain point you can't trick. And me as a non-tricker was like, you guys are just lazy. You're not putting in enough reps. But then very quickly when I started coaching more and I had students who wanted tricking in their forms, and then I would start repping those students the way that I knew to rep, I saw in real time, like, oh, wait a minute. After like the third rep, this really is not looking good. Like you're going to hurt yourself, right? And so that was, I would say at one point in my life, I thought that was something that should be debunked and that people were just being lazy. But no, trickers, if you are struggling with the volume of forms reps that you're getting in a day, I get it. I understand it. I'm not going to criticize you guys anymore. But if you're just doing a weapons form, you should be getting 10 full form reps a day. I don't care who you are. But So I think maybe that's a way of avoiding the question a little bit. But I think generally the reason that I struggle to come up with like something to debunk is because I think a lot of the advice that you hear out there nowadays is pretty good. There's a lot of resources. There's a lot of sport karate based podcasts. There's a lot of former champions like myself that are posting reels and tutorials and things like that. And generally, when I see these things, a lot of the content is really good advice, right? About the best way to prepare yourself for a tournament, the right nutrition to have in a tournament, picking a good tournament for you to start at. I think a lot of the advice that's out there is pretty good advice. And so there's really not many things that I hear consistently that I'm like, oh, that is so wrong. You know what I mean? I think for the most part, the resources out there are pretty good at keeping it straight for people.
If you had to change something entirely in tricking, what would it be?
I think you mentioned culture. So I think I would not want to change the culture of tricking, but I would want to change the perception of the culture of tricking, right? Because I think that tricking in some ways developed a little bit of a more underground, rugged type of culture about them from the outside looking in. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I mean it the same way that like people would look at breakdancing or skateboarding and things like that, right? But the problem with that is that it makes it so that it's never really taken seriously as a sport, right? It's like, yes, maybe Shaun White or maybe Tony Hawk will get clout for it. But outside of that, it's like, oh, well, this is kind of it's a fun activity. It's a hobby, but it's not really a sport. You know what I mean? And so I think that tricking absolutely should be considered a sport in and of itself, outside of just sport karate. I think events like Red Bull Throwdown that they used to have, I think that those events do a great job of bringing some professionalism to it. The Hooked Gathering, I see some of the stuff that happens at that tricking gathering, and I think that they do a great job of kind of producing tricking to make it more of a sport while also staying into with tricking culture. So I wouldn't change tricking culture at all, but I would say that if there was a way that I could press a magic button and change people's perception of tricking culture, then I would certainly do so. Within sport karate, the part of tricking that I would change is people land on their knee way too much. I just think if we're watching forms and we're seeing like 4 or 5 dudes in a row and like they're landing on their knee from a trick 2 or 3 times a form, it's like, okay, over half of the tricks that we're doing, we're not landing on our feet. We're just like crashing down into a superhero pose. And then we stand up the same way every time. And then we go on about our form, right? And so it makes it repetitive. And also it's more impressive to land the trick standing up, right? And if you go back in the day, and now, I'm going to sound like an old timer, back in my day, but if you go back and you watch the trickers of old, like Matt Innig didn't land on his knee all that often. Mark Canonizato, Sammy Vasquez, Steve Tirada, Rudy Raynon, and then even generation before that, your Carmichaels and your John Valeras and your Mike Chats, you go back and you watch those forms from like the early 90s through the late 2000s, people weren't landing on their knees all that often. It was only as tricking got crazier and crazier, and it is easier to land on the knee, that because people are trying crazier stuff, they're pairing it with an easier landing more often, right? So I think the next step that we'll see in tricking's evolution from a sport karate perspective is more people that are able to do the big crazy stuff and land on their feet instead of having to go to the knee. And not every athlete that lands on the knee has to go to the knee. I don't mean to word it that way. But there are certainly examples where people are not ready to land a trick on their feet, so they put it in their form landing to the knee just so they could do it. And it's just a little pet peeve of mine, but it's not the end of the world.
Do you think there's a clear distinction between tricker fans and martial arts fans?
I think that, ultimately, for me personally, the fact that I was a Forms and Weapons competitor, now when I watch Forms and Weapons, my brain is naturally critical of what I'm watching, because for years and years and years, I looked for every single thing that I could capitalize on in my opponents. And I looked for every single thing that was wrong with my form so that I could be better. And so my brain is wired to be critical of Forms and Weapons, which is why I find myself being a much better fan of point fighting, which surprises a lot of people. But If you gave me the option between sitting down and watching a point fighting division and sitting down and watching a weapons division, I'm going to go watch the point fighting division because that's what I enjoy being a spectator of more. But I think the biggest difference is that it requires two different sets of knowledge. When I decided that I wanted to be a fan of point fighting, which essentially was when I got on Paul Mitchell because I wanted to cheer for my point fighting teammates, there was so much that I had to learn. Like, just because I was a martial artist did not mean that I automatically understood point fighting, right? There was a huge learning curve where there were so many strategies, the reasons that competitors moved in certain ways, different little intricacies about judging, different intricacies about the rule sets and different leagues, right? There was so much for me to learn to become a fan of point fighting. And so ultimately, I think the biggest difference that we see in fans is typically whatever you do is the thing that it's easier for you to be a fan of because you have a baseline understanding of it. And so if somebody's been practicing tricking in their backyard, then when they go and watch tricking on YouTube, they're going to connect to that a lot better than if they switch over to a point fight and they're like, it's totally foreign to them, right? And so, I don't think it's so much of a personality thing as it is just like people are comfortable with what they know. And if you want to be a fan of one or the other, there's typically a big knowledge gap that you have to fill in order to be a fan.
Did you think like the sport would change over time, or would it just be like the same thing as you went off to go to med school and et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the sport has evolved since I was kind of in the midpoint of my career. From the midpoint of my career on, live streaming became more popular, and so people were better able to watch full-length sport karate events on the internet as opposed to just watching individual forms. But I do think there's a role for both, which is the reason that Gabrielle and I with Sport Karate Zone, that's the reason we post the individual videos, because as the sport featured more live streaming, there were less and less individual videos, right? I think that we need both in order to generate a following. No different than how you should be able to watch the NBA basketball game, but then also go on YouTube and watch the highlights, right? So I think we need both of those in sport karate. But I do think a big thing that changed during my career is when I started, there was no live stream, right? The only full-length sport karate events that you could watch was if you tuned into the U.S. Open or if you went to the black and blue video booth and Wally Faulkner sold you a DVD of the 2005 Diamond Nationals finals or whatever it is, which I would kill to have that full collection, by the way. But that's beside the point. And so I love the fact that the sport evolved to have more full-length sport karate events available on the internet. I think that a shortcoming of the sport during my time as a competitor is that there was never an expansion to other platforms, right? I think that we compete in a sport that historically has been very focused on the Olympics and how can we ever get sport karate to be an Olympic sport. I think point fighting and what Waco is doing with kickboxing and point fighting, I think that falls under an Olympic umbrella. And even traditional karate, as we saw as a demonstration sport in Tokyo. I think that, traditional martial arts, I think that point fighting, I think those things absolutely can be Olympic sports. I think extreme martial arts belongs in the X Games. I don't think that it fits the typical Olympic formula. So I think that anybody that has been focused on trying to make extreme martial arts an Olympic sport, I think they're missing the mark. I think that the X Games is a more attainable place for sport karate to one day try to live and have that be like the big premier event, right? And on top of that, the U.S. Open has done an amazing job of maintaining relationships with ESPN, maintaining relationships with other streaming services. And that's something I would encourage other tournaments to do, right? I know that the U.S. Open and the powers that be at the U.S. Open are willing to make partnerships with other tournaments to potentially have more events covered by ESPN. I think that that's something that's been in discussions for a long time, but there's a number of logistic reasons that hasn't happened. But if you're a tournament promoter and you have a big event and you don't have interest in aligning with some of these other tournaments, why haven't you been on the phone with Amazon Prime? Why haven't you, contacted Netflix or YouTube TV or whatever the streaming service is, Peacock, whoever, right? Because all of these streaming services that are out there have a ton of viewership and they're always looking for something new and exciting to try to feature. And so one thing that does surprise me is that there's not more tournaments that have done that. There's not more tournaments that have gone and found these third-party streaming platforms. And it seems that a lot of tournaments are content to just let our own community cover, right? And Sport Karate Zone is included in that. And I'm big on shouting out all of the Sport Karate media entities because they're all a huge part of allowing fans to learn about the sport. So not only Sport Karate Zone, but sportmartialarts.com has been at it for longer than any of us. Point Fighter Live, Martial Arts Inter Network, and the podcast that they host, and they're doing some event coverage as well. And that's just to name a few of these platforms that are doing a really good job of covering sport karate. But I think that tournament promoters should not just be content with, sport karate companies covering it for our own community. Ultimately, we need to reach out and spread the sport to a larger community. I'll also give credit to the Ocean State Grand Nationals for getting their deal with the CW network. So again, they're going outside of the martial arts industry and connecting with a new audience. I think that's something more tournaments should do, and I'm surprised that more tournaments didn't do that while I was still competing, with my generation.
Yeah, I was gonna say when I went so I grew up in the AAU circuit, and that was like my bread and butter. And I always wanted to see last year's matchups, but either someone had to have it in their weird dinky like phone in a weird angle, and I was just like, where could this be? And I kind of came to the conclusion there's a little bit of a stigma towards like martial arts for some reason, because I think it's the greatest thing on earth, but only we can agree on that. But I was trying to debunk that stigma a lot, like during my childhood. Everyone's like, "Oh, show me," or like, "Show me a trick, show me a kick, like, do something," right? And I'm like, "Well, okay, like, but you don't do the same for like a soccer player, a basketball player. It's more mainstream." And that's what I love about like the UFC. Even if the UFC is so deviated from tricking and just forms in general, it does give that a little bit of education that people do need to know about the sport, because like obviously I'm biased, but like this is the greatest sport to ever exist. And you get to learn so much about yourself, about the relationships, and just be better at your craft all at the same time. And I feel like I used to be a really bad student. I used to be like the guy that can never do the splits. Like I had a nice V with my legs, and I just didn't let that stop me. And the same thing with you, like you weren't like the most vertically gifted. So it's the same thing. Like just keep going, keep pushing, that sort of thing. And we're starting to wrap up. What advice would you give to your younger self when he just started competing? And what advice would you give to your peak self?
I think for my younger self, I would say to enjoy every moment. Don't get caught up in the competition, right? I think that when I was still trying to make a name for myself, even after I got on Paul Mitchell in my teenage years, because I talked about earlier, like how even as an adult trying to go on another U.S. Open streak, it was part of me trying to prove myself to myself, right? And so I think that the reminder for the younger version of me would be to just enjoy every moment. I look back and there were so many tournaments that I was so fixated on the result, and I was so inundated with the strategy and what's the right decision and executing the form that the tournament itself was a blackout. And next thing you know, I'm happy because I'm going home with a Warrior Cup or this trophy or that trophy or whatever. But I look back on it, I'm like, man, I didn't take a moment to smell the roses on stage. Like I got up there and I did my job, and that was that. And I didn't appreciate it in the moment. And I thank God that I started to do that late in my career. I would say from 2019, obviously didn't compete much in 2020 because after Irish Open is when COVID happened. But then with US Open in 2021. So those tournaments, the full 2019 season and then those couple of stragglers, that was when I really realized, because a couple of my buddies had stepped away from competing, right? In 2019, Reed and Cole weren't competing. Tyler Weaver wasn't competing. So Shaheen Jahanbash wasn't competing as much. A lot of my guys that I had traveled the circuit with for years had stepped away from the sport. And that was what opened my eyes and helped me realize, like, hey, your days are numbered. You're going to go to medical school and you're not going to get to do this forever. And you need to appreciate those moments when you're up there. And I really started doing that in 2019. And I'm forever grateful that happened. And the moment that I go back to most is the moment that almost made me not come back in 2021 for the US Open. And that was 2020 Irish Open. We go to that tournament. Rumors are already swirling about the COVID pandemic. And in fact, we were landing in Ireland as the news was breaking about the outbreak in Italy. There was a huge outbreak in Italy. People that really dove into all the COVID stuff might remember this. But early on in the COVID timeline, there was this big outbreak in Italy that everybody was super scared, right? And still the mood in the United States was it's not going to get over here. This is no big deal, right? But Italy was the first moment that it felt like Americans were oh, wait, their GDP is kind of up there. Maybe this could happen to us, right? And so I remember being at Irish Open, and obviously everybody was talking about it. There was actually a team from Italy that was not allowed to come to the event. There were phone calls made from the powers that be, and they were like, "Hey, you guys don't need to come here right?" And so the tournament wound up still happening, despite the fact that COVID was starting to become a bigger deal in Europe. And I remember competing in that moment with all of that swirling around. I remember doing my last form at Irish Open. And there they didn't have grand championships and stuff like that. It was just, if you won your division, that was winning the Irish Open. And run that last division. And for the first and only time in my career, I got straight 10s from every judge. I've gotten 10s before. I've gotten a handful of them before, but never had every judge on the panel give me 10s. And I got full 10s for that last form in Ireland. And one of the great things about competing at Irish Open as an American is you go to American tournaments and the crowds have seen you before. The crowds have watched you even, 12 times that same year, 5 times that same tournament. They've seen you multiple times do your thing. And so when you go over to Europe as an American, most of the people watching you, it's the first time they've ever gotten to see you compete. And so the energy is different. And I remember the closest thing that I can compare it to is what I imagine it must feel like to win a golf tournament, right? At the very end of a golf tournament, everybody is crowded around the 18th green. And I always relate golfers to martial artists because we have a very similar respect and courtesy and customs about us and the way that we carry ourselves. And, bowing to my competitors and bowing to the judges, and my competitors came off the mat. I was getting the round of applause, and I vividly remember kind of, doing the golfer thing and giving the wave in each direction and taking a bow every direction and then stepping off the mat. And that was really a full circle moment where it was I took a full 30 seconds there on that mat in Ireland and smelled the roses and appreciated that moment that I'd been blessed with. And the crowd reciprocated. And it was really, really special. And in 2021, once we were coming out of COVID and I was thinking about maybe one more ride at the US Open, going back to that Irish Open and thinking man, what better way to end than that? You know what I mean? That I would be totally content with that being my last sport karate memory, right? And then ultimately I made an even better memory at US Open. So it all worked out in the end. But again, I think the biggest thing, whether it's to my younger self or in my prime, because as I mentioned, in my prime, I still hadn't really figured out to smell the roses. That would be the biggest advice. And so for any competitors out there today that you're so focused on the training and you're so focused on climbing the ladder and you're so focused on winning this title or that title, when you get on that stage, when you're under those lights, when you have a crowd behind you, just remember to take a moment and appreciate it because those moments are fleeting. And when it's gone, you'll miss it. Even if you took 2 or 3 years to appreciate it like I did, you'll still miss it when it's gone. So make sure you appreciate it while you can. The phase in my life that I was in when I did that last form at US Open, I knew that a new chapter was open because I was weeks away from, going to military training and starting medical school. And so it was very, very front of my mind that a new chapter was going to be written immediately after that moment, right? Uh, but I also knew that a huge part of my identity was being a martial artist, was being a competitive martial artist, was being the best bow competitor on the planet. Like in the last few years of my career, that was part of who I was. That meant a lot to me to be that guy. I took a lot of pride in being that person, right? And I think that that's what helped make that U.S. Open that much more special. Was that the show itself was kind of a hustle and bustle. And there's a long story here, but I wound up doing both commentating in the booth and competing in the same night show. It was a very unique set of circumstances that made that possible. And it involved me changing out of a suit and into a uniform and competing about 20 minutes later, which I don't recommend to anybody. Uh, but I wouldn't change it for anything because it was a wild memory. And I can say with a pretty good degree of confidence that I'll probably be the only competitor to ever do exactly that, because I was wild enough to say yes to the offer to do it. And so the show itself was a lot of hustle and bustle, but Men's Weapons was the final event of the evening. And so I was very intentional about the move that I selected to be the last move of that form, because it was a double entendre. It had two layered meanings to it. And if anybody has seen that form, I ended my form by doing the zero gravity throws, so throwing the bow from behind my back, spinning horizontally. And then instead of catching it on the back of my hand, as was my signature move, what I did was I lifted my arms up. And then as the bow came down, I kind of sucked the bow into my chest, and I caught the bow in this position up against my chest. And the double meaning there, not only was it a cool move, but the double meaning there was the very first time that I had ever been on stage at a NASKA tournament was the Diamond Nationals in 2008 for traditional forms. And I had a signature, as much of a signature move as you could have as a 10 or 11-year-old. But I had a signature move where at the end of my form, I would get down into a low cross-legged stance, and I would bring my hands together and I would hold that position before I would finish my form. And so in some ways, that was kind of taking everything back to that first stage appearance. And then obviously, you probably tell by the way I talk and the way that I post on social media that I'm a follower of Christ, and my faith is a huge part of my life. And so, of course, I wanted some of that symbolism with it being a prayer stance as well. And I held that last position for a good few seconds before the form was actually over. And in that moment, a huge emotional release, because as soon as the bow was caught in my arms, I knew it was over. I knew that was it. You know, you fought the good fight, you finished the race, you kept the faith, right? And there was still another yell to be had after that. And then the last bow that I took after the form isn't actually the bow that I remember. The bow that I'll always remember is after everybody had cleared the room, or I thought everybody had cleared the room. They were like tearing down the stage, and like all the production staff was putting things away. And I walked on stage one more time before they ripped the mats up. And I just stood there in silence for a few minutes and said a prayer and took one more bow and just looked out over the empty room on that U.S. Open stage and kind of took that mental screenshot. And that'll be the memory that I have forever. The funny thing about it is that it turns out that Jake Presley, obviously a protege of mine who competed against me in that men's weapons final, he was apparently still in the room, and I didn't know it. And Jake the whole time was trying to tell me like, no, this can't be the last one. This can't be the last one, right? And just because he loved me, right? And I remember Jake when I walked out of the room, he was like, I saw that, right? And I'm like, what? And he's like, this really is it, isn't it? And I was like, that was it. Because, I hadn't been very public about it. I didn't want to be that guy that made a big Facebook post and said, this is my farewell tour. And because then on, the rumors starting like, oh, the judge just gave it to him because they knew it was his last one. I didn't want any of that to surround it, right? And I also wanted the freedom that if I ever did want to come back, I could, right? So I wasn't very public about the fact that I thought it was going to be my last form. But when Jake saw me taking in that moment like that after the show, he knew. And that's just a pretty cool little side story from that memory. But that'll be the moment that I remember forever.
That's awesome. I had a very similar moment myself, and you just don't expect it. And I got a little emotional when I did my last bow because I taught martial arts, specifically like taekwondo and a little bit of boxing. When you don't expect it, that's where it's the best. And I truly think that just having that a little bit of alone time is like the best like screenshot, like that mental screenshot you were saying that is the most valuable. Well, Jackson, thank you so much for coming on. Is there any last minute message you want to send out to the people listening?
Yeah, man. I just want to thank you for the opportunity to come on the show and just talk about my experiences and hopefully inspire some more people along the way, because that's what it's all about, to help the sport continue to grow and help change the lives of other people like it changed my life. And so I just want to thank everybody for tuning in, for listening to my stories and my ramblings about, the blessings that I've had in life. And again, just one more time, all thanks to the Most High, and none of this would be possible for me without my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And I think that's all the thank yous that I've got. Oh, in addition to mom and dad, couldn't have done it without mom and dad too. So I want to give a big thank you to them as well. But yeah, thanks for the opportunity, and it's been a pleasure, my man.